Welcome everybody to tonight's session. The title is Bet You Can't Eat Just One by Alison Riddiford. Alison is a certified nutrition consultant and professional speaker based in Scottsdale, Arizona. She specializes in optimizing individual health through balanced nutrition and lifestyle changes. Alison works with people just like you who want to learn how proper nutrition can help you look and feel your very best. Through personal experience and work with many clients over the years, Alison has become a proponent of the low carb lifestyle. Tonight, she will talk about the struggle of processed food addiction and the impact these foods have on our health. And I don't know about anyone else, but I am super psyched for this talk. And with that, Alison, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Pete, very much for your introduction tonight. I'm sure that most of you, I bet all of you, are familiar with that catchphrase, bet you can't eat just one. That was a Lay's potato chip ad back in the 1960s. But it's really stood the test of time because it's true. I mean, that is something that we're finding with many foods today. I'm sure that we all have some of those foods that when we pick up one, we just can't stop and we keep eating. Take just a second and put into the chat to everyone one or two of those foods that come to mind for you. I'm seeing chips, I'm seeing Cheez-Its. Ooh, that used to be one for me. Chocolate. There's kind of a common theme with the things that you are seeing, and that is that they're processed foods. That's what I'm going to focus on tonight, are these processed foods. If you took Lay's up on that bet, chances are you probably lost. In hindsight, that was really our warning, that they were going to be making all these foods that we were not going to be able to stop at one for. I'm going to share my screen real quick. So we can get started now, without any kind of judgment, shame, or guilt. I want you to answer these questions just to yourself, just in your mind. Do you often find that you eat more than you really want to? Do you eat for reasons other than hunger? Do you have constant cravings, thinking, or even obsessing about food, even when you're not hungry? Do you hide wrappers, overeat late when everyone's asleep, or avoid eating in front of others? Have you ever felt bad or guilty about your eating? I know that at many points in my life, I have answered yes to a number of those questions. If you did too, it might indicate that you have a tendency toward addiction when it comes to processed foods. Often, we don't even know we've become addicted to something until we try to put the brakes on and we find that those brakes just don't work. We keep doing or using something even though we kind of regret it. You don't have to be overweight or an overeater to be addicted to these foods. It affects people of all ages, shapes, and sizes. It's all about the behavior in reaction to the food. You may agree or disagree tonight with the use of the word addiction when it comes to food. And I'm not here tonight to try to convince you whether this is a true addiction or not. Although I can tell you that science is starting to prove that these foods are in fact addictive, and the behaviors that people display with regards to these foods, they also meet the criteria for addiction. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. What I do want to say at the outset is that we really tend to blame ourselves when we can't control how much we eat of certain foods. it gets chalked up a lot of times to lack of willpower or even laziness. This is not the case. The foods are controlling us. And it's time that we start putting the blame where it belongs. And that is on the food industry. I'm going to explain this in a little bit. What is processed food? I'm sure that most of you are familiar with them, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. There's some examples here in the picture, and I'm going to review just some of the criteria. One thing is that these foods have been chemically or physically transformed using an industrial process. They are mass produced. They generally come in a package. The reason they have a long freezer or shelf life is because they're filled with preservatives, and these preservatives really wreak havoc, not just on our bodies, but also on our brains. The food label will generally contain at least 5, but typically many more ingredients. And a lot of those ingredients, you will have no idea what they are, maybe even can't even pronounce them. These foods, they come from a factory. They don't come from nature. If it doesn't run, jump, swim, fly, or grow in the ground, it is somewhat of a processed food. And the degree of that processing really varies. Very often, these foods are made up of added sugar, salt, fat, and then starches, and they're all blended together with artificial colors and flavors, and then stabilizers are added to hold it all together. That combination of the fat, the salt, the carbs, the flavoring makes these foods what's called hyperpalatable. They create a party in your mouth. They are made to just be super, super tasty. The bottom line is that these really aren't foods, they're formulations. But why are they so bad? Well, the biggest thing is these foods lack nutrients. They're just not nourishing us at all. And they're taking up the space that we could be filling with nourishing food. Rarely do they contain protein, if any. It's hard to find protein in these foods. They're loaded with unhealthy seed oils, and they're often high in sugar. One reason it's hard to control how much we eat of these foods is that they mess up our body's hunger signaling. Our bodies don't produce the hormones that tell us that we're full. So these foods are almost impossible not to overeat. We require a certain amount of nutrients every day. And when we don't satisfy those requirements, our brains and our bodies say, you're still hungry, keep eating, because we need to fulfill those nutrients. This has led to a state where many of us are now overfed and undernourished. We are literally starving for nutritious food. These processed foods, they also cause illness and disease. It could be kind of minor things, digestive issues, migraines, joint pain, skin problems like acne or eczema, psoriasis. Or it could be more serious things, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, mental disorders, anxiety, depression, attention deficit. They're even associated with cancer. We don't want any of these things. The implications of eating these foods really, really worry me. It's estimated right now that over 50% of US adults are either pre-diabetic or diabetic. 42% are obese. And the numbers that these things are happening in our kids, even the type 2 diabetes rate, are just skyrocketing, which is really sad. I heard a statistic yesterday that 1 in every 3 kids born today it's estimated, will be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes sometime in their life. 1 in 3. This is a health crisis, and it's driven in large part by the processed foods. Let's talk a little more about the effects these foods have on your brain, because that is going to help us start to understand the addictive nature. Now, keep in mind, scientists for large food companies, they are hired to spend 40+ hours a week. Their full-time job designing and developing foods that exploit the way that our brain processes pleasurable sensations. That's their whole job. They want these foods to be addictive, and they are very good at their job. They want us to feel so good when we eat them that we just can't stop ourselves from reaching for more. The pleasurable sensations we get are the result of a dopamine surge. That's our pleasure hormone. The dopamine hits your prefrontal cortex. That's kind of in the forehead area of your brain. And that's one of our pleasure and reward centers. And when it hits, these pleasure neurons, which are also called addictive neurons, they are generated, they're created. It makes us feel good. This dopamine hit, it's so quick and potent that some neuroscientists believe that people find processed foods as addictive as opioids, alcohol, or nicotine. Now, it's important to understand what else is affected in that prefrontal cortex, because these processed foods, they basically hijack our brain. They take over the frontal lobe. Blood flow is actually pulled away from the prefrontal cortex, and it's pushed toward these pleasure neurons, these addictive neurons. The two areas are pretty much in a battle, and unfortunately, the prefrontal cortex usually loses. That is problematic because this area is also in charge of some really important functions: judgment, decision-making, attention, impulse control. Think about how those 4 things might impact food choices. This is why it's not a lack of willpower. It's not laziness that leads to overeating these foods. It explains why when you take your first bite and you get that dopamine hit, it will be very hard to judge how much to eat, decide to stop eating, or to not impulsively reach for another handful. This is where bet you can't eat just one comes from. Think about that attention part here for a minute. If you're heading off to work, or maybe you're sending your kids off to school, and for breakfast you had cereal, pastries, a granola bar, not only will you be starving later when you have a sugar crash, but it's also going to be really difficult to pay attention. All right, now that you understand what's going on in the brain, let's look at the cycle of addiction. It starts with some type of a trigger or a cue. Now, that may be simply that you're hungry, but we also eat these foods when we're not hungry. Why does this happen? Well, that's where the cues and the triggers play a pretty big role. A cue or a trigger, it might be an emotion. It could be happy, sad, anxious, even tired. It can also be a certain setting, an activity, or certain people. You, for example, let's say you go to the movies, and when you go to the movies, you always order a large buttered popcorn. Or maybe you eat chips every time you're watching TV. Just arriving at the theater, turning on the TV, those 2 things are going to start activating those pleasure or addictive neurons, and they're going to trigger a craving for the food. That's called an associative cue. And it makes sense because as we evolved, we had to remember everything about where and when we found food because it was really scarce. This is called time stamping. And while it may have saved our lives hundreds of years ago, it is not serving us very well today. That trigger leads to consumption. And once we consume the food, then we get that wonderful dopamine hit, and it feels great. But this is also the time that those hijackers arrive, and they take over our decision-making. Now you're in a little bit of trouble. Perhaps you told yourself, this time when I go to the movies, I am not going to have popcorn. I'm just going to buy a water bottle. But you walk into that familiar setting, you smell that wonderful smell of popcorn, and those cues are just too strong, and you end up giving in. Now, this often results in guilt or shame, even though it was the addictive brain cells that took over your judgment and decisions. That was not your logical self doing that. These emotions, the guilt, the shame, the fatigue, those are often a trigger for another craving. And then that whole cycle begins again. All right, let's talk about how we got here. I'm gonna take a sip of water first. We have all, I'm sad to say, been the subjects of a 50-year-long experiment by the processed food industry. And we didn't even give our permission to be in this experiment. While these foods started being developed in the 60s, they really took off beginning in the 80s. Not coincidentally, at the same time, the tobacco industry was really suffering because we finally figured out and we're letting people know that cigarette smoking was really bad for us. Guess what happened? Philip Morris was a leader in the tobacco industry for over 40 years, but business started kind of dropping off because the whole cancer thing. So they decided that they were going to shift gears. In 1985, they bought General Foods. And in 1988, they bought Kraft Foods. The processed food industry exploded over the next 20 years. It was being run by tobacco executives who were experts at making products addictive. They did their job a little bit too well. Now, eventually they spun off these food companies, but the damage was already pretty much done. Today, only 10 companies control almost every large food and beverage brand in the entire world. Isn't that crazy? And by the way, Lay's falls under the PepsiCo brand there. They are a powerful force, these companies, and they push addictive foods through advertising, availability, and affordability. The other thing is these companies, they really want us to believe that all calories are equal. It doesn't matter what you eat, you just need to eat less and move more. This could not be further from the truth. I talked about the conditions that eating excess processed foods are associated with. This is just a marketing ploy, this all calories are created equal business. It really shifts the blame away from these big food companies. And where does it put it? It puts it on the consumer. And that just leads to an increase in the guilt and the shame that we already struggle with. They also get really sneaky on labels. I don't care if a product says organic, multigrain, enriched with vitamins and minerals. These foods are not healthy. So don't fall for that marketing hype. The really sad thing is a lot of this marketing targets kids, and cereal commercials and boxes like the one on the screen. These are really good examples of this. Processed food addiction can start at a very young age. And the earlier it starts, the harder it is to overcome. But it's not impossible. And that leads me into what can we do about this? Well, one thing you could do is just stop eating processed food. That's just not realistic at all. I mean, it would work, but that's like telling an alcoholic, just don't drink alcohol, or a drug addict, just stop doing drugs. It's a much more complicated process than that. Plus, we don't need to smoke, drink, or gamble to sustain life, but we do need to eat. And that complicates this one a little further. Combine that with the fact that these foods, they're socially acceptable, they're even encouraged, and they're highly advertised. This is the only highly addictive thing that's allowed this kind of advertising. And we're up against a really large, successful industry. The first thing that I really encourage you to do is just awareness. Think of those questions that I asked you at the very beginning of the presentation. Be honest with yourself about the answers. Recognize those foods that have control over you. And think about what you learned tonight and why this happens. The degree to which these foods are addictive or are a problem, it's very individualized. For some people, total abstinence from these foods might be necessary. For the short term, maybe forever. And for others, some point of moderation can probably be reached. But that's something that you have to figure out as you go. As you work on making changes, keep in mind how your brain gets hijacked. Stop the blaming and the shaming. Clean house. Make your house a safe zone for eating. Start with removing those foods that you just can't control once you start eating them. And for the record, this might not even be a processed food. One food I have a hard time controlling is macadamia nuts. That's a healthy thing. But once I eat one handful, I go back for more and I go back for more. And I definitely overeat them. They don't even make me feel good, but they get a hold of my brain and I can't stop eating them. Open up that trash can, figure out the foods that you just can't have in your house, throw them away, and replace them as much as you can with whole, unprocessed, or minimally processed alternatives. If these foods make up a big part of your diet, do expect some withdrawal symptoms. This can manifest in many ways, and I have some of them listed here. You're not going to get all of these if you decide to give up your processed food. But if you do eat a lot of it and then you get rid of it, expect some of these withdrawal symptoms and plan for them. If you are feeling irritable, maybe you decide, I'm going to go for a walk or sit in the sun or call a friend. Have a plan and just expect this to happen. Here's the good news though. Typically, these symptoms last from 2 to 8 days. So you're looking at a week. And after a week, you can really focus on the positive changes that are happening. Because I can almost guarantee you are going to feel a lot better. Your digestion's going to be better. Maybe you had bloating that goes away. You may have lost some weight. Whatever it is, increased energy, a clear mind. Start focusing on those positive things. If you have a lapse, just know it's temporary. Don't beat yourself up about it. Notice how it made you feel when you ate that food, and then just get back on track. I always like to mention sleep. Fatigue and sleep deprivation are huge cues to overeat. And what you generally crave is going to be the food that gives you that quick energy, usually sugar or processed carbs. If you can identify what your cues and your triggers are, you can stop stimulating that reward system and stay out of the cycle of addiction. One thing you can do is you can try to neutralize the cues. You kind of rewire your brain to associate the substances with pain. Now, I don't want you to go and kick yourself every time you eat a potato chip. But instead of, when you see a bowl of potato chips, instead of thinking, oh, that looks so good, it's going to taste delicious, think to yourself, if I eat that, I might get a headache. I might get a stomach ache afterward. I'm not going to feel very good tomorrow. If you start telling your brain a different story, it will actually start rewiring those neurons and help get rid of that addictive behavior. And last, but probably the most important thing, is to surround yourself with supportive people. Have you ever heard the phrase, you are the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with? There's an actual scientific reason for that phrase. We have something in our brain and it's called mirror neurons. Those are neurons that make us want to be like other people that we spend a lot of time with. This also makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint, because 1,000 years ago, if you were a total independent, separate from everyone else, you would have ended up just starving. So if the people that you hang out with eat a lot of processed food, it's going to be a little bit challenging for you to stop eating them. But you have a couple options. You could stop hanging around with them, although sometimes those are our immediate family members, so might not work very well. You can share what you learned tonight and try to encourage them to join you in making some healthy changes. That would be my favorite option. Or just minimize your time with them, even if it's in the short term while you're trying to deal with this and make changes, and find a community of support. There are many options out there. There are both in-person and online communities, and they are set up to resolve not just processed food addiction, but all sorts of addictions. Find a tribe, find a group of people that think in a similar way to how you want to be thinking, especially when it comes to these foods. You could even start listening to podcasts or reading books or articles. All these things are going to keep you motivated because they're going to activate new mirror neurons and they're going to deactivate those addictive ones. Just like any other addiction program, having a supportive group of people is the key to resolving the whole pattern. Now, it can take up to a year to fully transition away from these ultra-processed foods, but don't be discouraged because it only takes about 2 to 3 weeks to start retraining your brain, open up those dopamine pathways, and start reversing disease. All right, this has been a lot of information. I hope that it inspires you to make some changes. I know from personal experience and from working with clients that people make change when they're ready. The important thing is you have this information. You have some tools to draw on when you're ready for it. Change doesn't happen all at once. You're not going to wake up tomorrow morning and give up all processed foods for the rest of your life. It just small, steady changes over time snowball into larger lifestyle changes. Give everything I've talked about some thought. Evaluate where you are, where you'd like to be when it comes to your health. Be honest about what your processed food triggers are and which foods are hijacking your brain. And a lot of work is being done in this area, and these are 2 of the leading names in the field right now. Dr. Joan Ifland, she has an entire processed food addiction program. She also has a wonderful Facebook and online community for people to reach out to. She's gotten a ton of great information. Her podcasts are wonderful too. Dr. Robert Lustig, also a wonderful source of information. His main focus is on sugar addiction. But this is a place to start. If you want to find a community of support and learn more about all the harm that processed food is causing us, check these two people out. Now we've left plenty of time so we can answer questions. If you think of a question later and you would like to throw it out there, just send an email, azlowcarb@gmail.com, and somebody will get back to you with an answer. Also, if you want to be informed of upcoming talks, we do these talks every month. I think we're going to switch to 2 months as summer approaches, on all sorts of different topics. So if you'd like to be included in the distribution list to receive an email when that talk is happening, you can also just reach out to azlowcarb@gmail, and we'll make sure that you get invited to the next talk. So I would love to take your questions, not just me. We have other practitioners here that will also answer questions for you. Fire away.
Great talk, Allison. I really appreciated that. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit. If you have somebody, perhaps it's a client, you've brought them in, you've had a lot of discussions with them, perhaps you've done some of the sugar assessments on them, and you've come to the conclusion that this individual is sugar addicted. What kind of protocol do you put them on in terms of a low carb diet? Could you just lay that out for us? Like a typical day, they're going to eat how many times, how low should the carbs be, that sort of thing.
First, I would say that is a different answer for every person, because you really have to assess where people are. But I will think of one client in particular who definitely has a sugar addiction. She's aware of it. She doesn't want to have the sugar addiction, but she has a really hard time overcoming it. For her, what we really worked on was not having it in the house. That was the very first thing. To back up a little bit and answer your question, my main focus for people, especially women that I work with, is to have them prioritize protein. Most of us are not getting enough protein. And if you don't get enough protein, along with not getting enough nutrients, your body, again, is going to keep telling you, keep eating, keep eating, keep eating. You haven't had enough protein. And we often reach for the things like the carbs and the sugar. And carbs, most of you on here probably know, those carbs, they break down into sugar. Mm. So when you're craving a cracker or you're craving a cookie, your brain is craving the same thing. So for people who are really strongly addicted to these foods, they cannot stop eating them. We get them out of the house. And the amazing thing is if you can just stay away for even 2 days, that craving goes away. And then we work on, don't put yourself in a situation where where it's going to be offered to you and you don't think that you can say no. Does that answer your question, Pete?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Daryl's unmuted. Do you have a question, Daryl?
Yes. Allison, I just went to the vegan arena, and which is heavily carbs. So I don't necessarily have the same, and I also went to intermittent fasting as well. Mm-hmm. So I do that as well, but and that certainly helped. But from a carb standpoint, because I hear the whole don't do carbs, don't do, because I do know about simple sugars versus complex sugars. And I guess I need to further explanation about that, because there are people who are maybe in the vegan world or in the vegetarian world that perhaps that is really all they do eat. Of course, there are foods that are at these markets that I go to that are filled with proteins and protein drinks, but still, can you elaborate a little bit further about carbs in terms of simple versus complex?
Yes. And that's a really good comment, Daryl. And I should have qualified when I was talking about lowering carbs for a client, because there are healthy carbs. I am not a person that thinks everybody should eat 0 carbs in their life. And if you are eating a vegan diet and that's working for you, you're going to be eating a lot of carbs. That's okay. Complex carbohydrates really are carbohydrates that come from natural foods, is the best way to put it. If you have these processed foods that I talked about tonight, I don't think one picture in there, I know one picture in there was not a complex carbohydrate. A complex carbohydrate is going to be your vegetables, your beans, your legumes. And those are just fine. If those work well for your body, then you should eat plenty of them. A combination that I would try to avoid is carbohydrates are energy and fat is energy. And you really want to avoid having too much energy. So what I would say to you is try to avoid at the same meal having a lot of fat and a lot of carbohydrate at the same time. Bacon and beans together is high carbohydrate and high fat. A baked potato with a bunch of butter and sour cream on it is high carbohydrate and high fat. And it just puts you in an energy excess. And then it's hard to use up all of that energy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. I mean, it also makes sense for the fact that I remember when I was eating, before I became vegan, I remember eating processed foods, and like even some unprocessed food like potatoes, French fries, things like that. The more fat you eat in it, you just crave more. I craved more at the time, whereas now I don't.
Yes.
So it's easier to do that to me. I like what you said. The addiction part is added to a lot of these foods, because I think that is true, because you just want more. When you eat, to me, when you eat fatty foods, you just want more and more of it. Fatty rich foods, you just want more and more of it.
Yeah, and it's usually a combination of fat, carbohydrate, and salt is usually in there too.
Yes.
Really trigger those addictive neurons. They really do take over.
Yes. Thank you.
Sure. Leslie?
Well, I'm just curious if you are have examples or places where that you would look to where like systemic change has taken root and affected, you know, families or communities, schools, even in a, you know, and just curious, like where you might point to, or areas, communities that are examples of doing it well.
Doing it well. Pete, I'm curious if you have an answer to that question.
I don't have any examples of that. And as Leslie was asking the question, I was thinking of Lustig's work, right? How much recent podcasts, and I'm actually looking in one of his publications, even not this second, but now basically, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is something like 20. I want to say, I was thinking about this as Leslie asked this question. It's somewhere around 20%, I think, in children. And there are other metabolic issues, even hypertensiveness and whatnot. So I don't know the answer to that. If there's a community doing this really well, and I'm an ex-teacher too, so I have to tell you, the worst offenders, I think, of this are happening in our schools, because the candy and the treats and the soft drinks and just permeate that culture. So, but maybe somebody else here does. I mean, I think that there's a lot of individualism happening, right? We're all here in this room together right now, and we're all eating real food diets, right? There might be variation here. Like I know Daryl is talking about veganism, and I'm pretty strict ketogenic warrior myself. I mean, we're all finding our way, but I think the common link in all that is real food. We cut it up, we cook it, we eat it. You know, at least that's what our goal is. So anyway, sorry. Maybe there's somebody else that might know of something systemic that's happening.
And also, Leslie, that is the goal. This is a new group, AZ Low Carb, that we've started. And the purpose of our group is to try to develop a community so that we can have an impact, not just here in Arizona, but Zoom platform, impacting as many people as we can. We are trying to develop that community. Yeah, Anne?
Yeah, there's I don't know if anybody's seen the movie that Michael Moore put out called Where to Invade Next. There's a segment in that movie about a European school that adopted some healthy eating programs for children. And it talked about how they spend an hour using fresh food and how they prepare it and how they sit down and they eat it together. And so that is an example that I don't think you can find here in the United States. I can't remember where it was. I think it was in France. But anyway.
I think Finland is ahead of the curve too in that area. It could have been there. Charlene asked a question in the chat about how much protein is too much. If you don't have any type of kidney disease, that's just a whole other animal. So I want to take that out right now. I usually tell people try to get a gram of protein per pound of optimal body weight. And that's so much more than most people are eating. So it's over 100 grams for all of us, I would say. Yeah, you don't really have to. There's been a lot of bad information about overeating protein. Your body is pretty darn good at breaking it down, unless you have some type of kidney dysfunction, and then you really need to work with somebody to make sure you're okay.
Can I piggyback on you?
Please.
I think it's really hard to overeat protein. I'm very active. I do a lot of CrossFit training, rock climbing, hiking during the week. Every day I'm doing something. And for a while I was really having some recovery issues, right? And the obvious thing is, all right, am I getting enough protein? So I started really pushing it. And I, besides the fact that my recovery did get better, it was faster and more efficient. One of the key things that I noticed was that it was really hard for me to get past 20%, you know, as a function of the total calories. I think the biggest day I had was 23%, and you're really working hard to do that because protein it's so satiating. You know, you start eating it and it's not long before you're like, well, I've had enough of that. You know, I think it's really hard to overeat protein to the degree that some people try to argue that you're eating too much. I don't think you can get to too much. And like Allison's saying, I think you know, if you've got a kidney disease situation, you're under the care of a doctor, that's different than what we're talking about. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there because I did really push hard on it, and it's really hard to get past 20%. I think my best day was 23, and that was it.
And you think about this whole brain process I was talking about and how these foods affect our judgment and our decision making. This doesn't happen when you have a plate of grilled chicken in front of you. You don't eat 4 pieces of grilled chicken and then think, oh, I'm just going to eat more. I'm just going to eat more. or broccoli or cauliflower. It just doesn't happen. I mean, this is a real thing, these foods that were created to make us overeat. Doesn't generally happen with proteins.
I think I have to agree with Dr. Pete on the protein. You can't eat enough protein. And there are no studies that it affects your kidneys. And I think that's a pile of BS. So you can eat as much protein as you can put in and stuff it down, because it's not just gonna build up your body. It's not gonna hurt you.
There was a question about protein powders. I get asked about protein powders a lot, and there are some good protein powders out there. My first response is always, your body is going to break down protein from real food the most efficiently. That's going to be the best way to get protein, because our body knows how to deal with it, and it's a full protein. Take an egg, it has enzymes in there, and it has all sorts of other things that help us absorb it properly. But sometimes we need a little supplement, or we're in a rush. And so there's nothing wrong with protein powders. I would just say be careful. Some of the pea protein powders in particular have been found, even the organic ones, to have heavy metals in them, pretty high levels of heavy metals. I like a organic, either plain whey protein, or there's bone broth proteins. If you are vegan, I would just do a lot of research to make sure that whatever you're getting has been tested. Some of these do get third-party tested to make sure that you're not ingesting heavy metals along with your protein. You also just have to read the ingredients. And Leslie is a friend of mine. She asked this question. So she will go to the grocery store and she'll take a picture and send me a food label and say, is this one I should buy or not buy? So be careful what the ingredients are. Make sure you're okay with whatever sweeteners they're using. A lot of them have artificial flavors. So I like the plain protein powders, organic, grass-fed if it's animal-based, and add your own flavoring, whatever that might be. Anyone else? All right. Okay. We'll call it a night. We will dismiss class early tonight. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It was wonderful to see all of your faces. I appreciate our Seattle contingent that came. That was wonderful. And if you would like to be informed of the next talk, make sure, if you're not already on our email distribution list, that you get on it. And we will let you know when we are meeting next time.